Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Alexander. I use he, him pronouns. I am one of the specialists in the Office of Student Success, and I also work on the financial education team. Today, we're going to be talking about navigating off-campus living and thinking through methods for budgeting and planning for both while you're in as a student, if you want to live on campus, off campus, excuse me, while you're still here at NYU, and also ways to make off-campus living a little bit more achievable once you graduate. Quick disclaimer, this is a workshop. This is a kind of a financial tools kind of session. This is not I have these apartments and I'm trying to sell you on them. We're not a broker. We're not a realtor. This is all for informational purposes. So disclaimer out of the way. Here's a quick overview of what we'll be talking about. So I'll spend a little bit of time going over some very, very, very basic terms and definitions that will help you kind of understand the rest of the material. Then we'll spend the bulk of our time really thinking through, all right, how am I going to budget for housing? How am I going to budget for food? How do I come up with these budgets? What are some figures that are realistic? Then we'll talk a little bit about how living off campus may interact with your financial aid for our current students and for students who are going to be continuing after this spring. And then we'll close out by talking about short-term housing very briefly, as well as some resources at the very end. And we'll also send out some resources after this presentation. So jumping right in. Again, these are some very, very, very basic terms. One of my colleagues, Eugene, is here with us, and he's going to be dropping in some links in the chat. One of those links will be to the off-campus housing website here at NYU. That has a much more in-depth kind of overview of different terms. So these are kind of some very, very sort of surface level ones. And so starting off, what's a lease, right? This is a contract between you, your roommates, and the landlord. It will have a few key things in it, such as the length of your lease. This is very important, right? Most leases are a year long. In some cases, you can get a 2-year lease, and also in some cases, you can get like a 6-month or a 9-month lease, but typically it's a year long. We'll also include the amount of rent that you're paying every single month and any special rules that the building has that you need to follow. So for example, in my current apartment, we, I guess, have a very fancy bathtub. And so it is in our lease, it's actually printed in the lease that we have to clean it using certain products at a certain schedule. Now, I've never had like my super come check the tub to make sure that it is cleaned in this way, but that is something that's in the lease. So that's the lease. Another thing that you'll want to keep in mind is what are utilities? So these are expenses outside of rent that you and your roommates will be responsible for on a recurring basis. Some of these may be covered in your lease. It's very common in New York City for like hot and cold water, for example, to be covered, or heat in the winter. That's usually covered in the city. Keep in mind, not every utility will often be covered in your lease. And so in some cases, you may be responsible, actually in most cases, you'll be responsible for internet. You'll be responsible if you want to get cable for that. So look in your lease when you're trying to figure out what your overall budget is and see what is and isn't covered, because that'll determine your overall budget and the cost that you pay. The next thing that I want to briefly go over is what's a security deposit. This is money that you pay your landlord before you move in, and it represents your intent to both live in the apartment and care for it. Usually you're able to get your security deposit back, but it is money that you need to pay up front. And I'll talk a little bit more about upfront costs. But keep in mind that as long as you don't do any damage to your apartment, your security deposit is money that you should get back at the end of your lease when you move out. Another fee that you may have to pay when you move in that you will not get back is called a broker fee. This is something that is pretty unique to New York City. In most other cities, the landlord pays this fee, but it's a one-time payment you make upon moving in to the broker, the person who listed the apartment and showed it to you. This fee is typically around 15% of the annual rent, which is a lot of money, and you don't get it back. And it's paid with your first month's rent and your security deposit when you move in. I would say if you are currently looking for an apartment, if you're apartment hunting, if at all possible, filter for no fee apartments, because broker fees are like thousands and thousands of dollars that you are not going to see back. There are some situations where it may make sense to take an apartment that has a broker fee. Like if you're going to be living there for many, many years and that apartment has significantly lower rent, that could be worth it. You can kind of do the math. Again, it's 15% of the annual rent. But this is just a fee that I would personally recommend people avoid because unlike a security deposit, you're never going to get it back. A type of apartment that you may find is called rent stabilized. There are also rent controlled apartments, but those are much less common. A rent stabilized apartment is a type of apartment where the rent on it can only go up by a fixed percentage annually. There are some links that Eugene can put in the chat that will give you a little bit more information about rent stabilization in New York City. These tend to be pretty coveted apartments. The apartment I'm moving into is actually rent stabilized. I'm very excited. I'm hoping I won't have to move for several years. And there are resources you have and kind of rights that you have as a tenant in a stabilized apartment that you might not have in other types of apartments. And the last basic term that I want to go over is a guarantor. A guarantor is, as it says on the screen, someone who guarantees to pay the rent if you're not able to do so. If you, for example, don't meet the income requirements, and we'll talk more about what those mean and what those are, but if you don't meet the income requirements for an apartment, it's very unlikely that a current student, by the way, would on their own meet those requirements. This is where you would want a guarantor. A guarantor is someone who can kind of say like, hey, if you're not able to pay the rent, this person is. Often this is a family member or a friend. There are some services. The off-campus housing website has a list of some of those services where you can pay someone to be a guarantor. But keep this in mind as an option if you're having trouble qualifying for an apartment on your own. I'll talk more about what that means in a bit. Moving on, the last sort of terms that I wanted to go over, these are things that you're more likely to see on listings, and these are hopefully here to help you kind of decode the listings that you may be seeing. The first one is a flex apartment. These are more common in luxury buildings. And when you see like a 3-bedroom that's a flex apartment, what it actually means usually is that it's a 2-bedroom apartment and then somebody took the living room and added a dividing wall, which is what made it into like a flex unit. There is some sort of conversion that has happened, usually in a non-permanent way. I have seen these more often in higher end buildings. So like these sort of luxury apartment buildings more commonly have flex units. They can be a great option if you want to live in that kind of building, but maybe can't afford it. So if you see flex in a listing, that's what that means. If you see walk up in a listing, these are typically older buildings. They don't have as many amenities as sort of luxury buildings. It is less likely that you're going to have laundry or bike storage or like a rooftop bar, those sorts of things. Walk-up apartments tend to be a little bit more bare bones. They're what I lived in for the first several years of living in the city. It's great because they do tend to be a little bit more affordable. So that's what it means when you see that in a listing. And then lastly, again, if you see luxury on an apartment listing, what New York City realtors mean when they say luxury and what I might mean when I say luxury, I think are different things. A lot of the times they'll say, oh, it has a dishwasher. That makes it a luxury unit. So keep that in mind. It usually means you're going to pay a little bit more, and often it indicates that there are going to be certain amenities in the building. So there's going to be a doorman. Maybe there'll be a gym. There's some type of lounge space that you might have access to as a tenant that you wouldn't have in other types of buildings. Whether or not that's worth it to you is totally up to you, but that's usually what that word means if you see it on a listing. So how do I actually find an apartment? There are lots of different ways to go about it. I've put some links here, and Eugene's going to include links in the chat. NYU doesn't endorse or recommend any of these over each other. I personally have used StreetEasy the most. I would say if you are looking for an apartment, which service you use depends on what you're actually looking for. So if you've got a group of friends and you all know that you want to live together, in that case, I would use something like StreetEasy because that's going to give you a unit to sign a new lease on. It'll be empty when you move in and you will all move in at the same time usually. If you're an individual and you're just like, I just want to live off campus, I don't really care who I live with, I'm going to find roommates and move into an existing apartment, that's when I would use like Facebook, or I would ask around. A lot of times there's like a class, like a, NYU class of et cetera Facebook group that you could use to sort of ask like, hey, who has an apartment, who's looking for roommates? So keep in mind that there are a couple of different options depending on what you need. Another resource I want to highlight is called the Listings Project. This is a weekly newsletter and it's curated and every listing on it is vetted. So it's a way for you to find out about the sort of smaller landlords and places where there's maybe a little bit more flexibility, and know that it's a little bit safer than using something like Craigslist. I've got actually a colleague in student success. She was able to find her apartment through the listings project, and she was able to kind of talk with the landlord one-on-one and work out a deal that worked for her. And so that's another resource. The other thing I'd like to say about finding an apartment is, if at all possible, visit the unit in person. The pictures on the listing 9 times out of 10 aren't actually of the unit, or they're several years old, or they're hiding certain features that may not be super desirable. You will quickly get a sense of things that you didn't realize were important to you, but suddenly are important when you actually visit for the first time. So things like, are there outlets where they need to be outlets, right? If you're planning on working from home, for example, and the only space that you could work in doesn't have any outlets, that may make this apartment less than ideal for you. Are the floors slanted? That is very common. Our current apartment, we actually have little pieces of wood underneath some of the furniture to keep it level. Are the closets A, numerous enough, and B, appropriately sized? Those are sorts of things that you're not going to be able to see from even video tours, but you will be able to observe when you actually visit the apartment. It also gives you a sense of like, does this building seem well maintained? Do they seem to take out the trash regularly? All of those sort of things that aren't immediately obvious upon a listing. So do try to visit in person if at all possible. This is an exercise that I think is really, really helpful to do with roommates and with anybody that you're going to be living with. If you're familiar with the show House Hunters, you've heard of a must list. This is sort of a 2-part must list that includes both what you need to have in an apartment and what you would like to have in an apartment. You may have heard that the housing market moves really, really quickly in New York City. And you often need to make a decision about whether or not you like an apartment within hours, if not minutes, of seeing it. It can move that fast. And so spending some time doing this exercise, understanding these are the things that are non-negotiable for me. You know, it is non-negotiable that I have laundry and building, for example, right? Understanding that will help you make a decision about a unit much more efficiently. It also makes sure that if you're living with roommates, you're all on the same page. That was something that my partner and I, we've been together for a long time. We've been living together for the past few years. I hadn't realized that some of the things that were really important to me were not important to her, and vice versa. I also learned very quickly after living in apartments that didn't have a dishwasher that I needed one, right? Those are the sorts of things you'll want to be thinking about when you're coming up with this list, because it'll help you make a decision more quickly. In terms of the timeline, I've said that it's fast, and typically when I say fast, I mean you will probably see an apartment and put in an application within a day at most. Typically, it takes another day to get approved, and then it may take a week or so for the lease to get put together, usually moving in a few weeks later. And so I'm moving at the end of May. I found the apartment that I want to live in first weekend in April, and we signed the lease yesterday. So that gives you usually a month or two is how much in advance you'll be looking. And oftentimes, if you're trying to look too far out, you either won't hear back from brokers, or they'll ask you like, hey, can you move in earlier? So if you, for example, want a place in August and you start looking right now, most of the apartments on the market right now are going for May 15th, June 1st, maybe June 15th move-ins. They're not going to offer you an August move-in, and for the most part. So keep that in mind. In terms of the steps, what you'll do is you will take a look at the listings, reach out to the brokers or to the landlords of the listings you like. You might not hear back from everyone. We sent out, when my partner and I last are planning our next move, we reached out to some 35, 40 different brokers, heard back from 5 or 6. We're able to arrange viewings at 2 different places that worked within our schedule. So keep that in mind. But the first step is to view the apartment. If you really like it, again, make up your mind fast. For the place that we're moving into, we sent in an application like an hour later. That was how fast it was. So then you apply. After your application is accepted, you sign the lease. Sometimes you'll have to go in person to sign the lease, so you may need to plan for that. And then after you sign the lease, again, it's usually a week or 2, maybe a couple more weeks, depending on what your timeline is, before you actually move into your apartment. So those are the basic steps. That's the kind of 101 high level, like these are the kind of core concepts. This is the process itself. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to approach your actual budget for housing and what are the sorts of things that you want to budget for, and also thinking through what's important to you when you actually come up with your budget and understanding that, especially with housing, there are certain things that you will just need to pay for. If you want to live in a certain neighborhood, for example, typically that means you have to be willing to spend a certain price because that's how it works, at least in New York City. And so in terms of, okay, what financial information do I need to have on hand if I'm applying for an apartment? Here is a basic list. In Manhattan in particular, landlords prefer and in most cases require that you have an annual income of at least 40 times the monthly rent. Landlords will also almost always run a credit check. Typically, they prefer that you have a credit of 690, 700 or higher. That's the sort of baseline, at least in Manhattan. Now, again, if you're working with a smaller landlord, if you're in other cities, those income requirements may be different. This is sort of assuming looking for an apartment again in New York City. In terms of documents, you will need to have a pretty long list. It can feel a little invasive sometimes when you're applying for an apartment because you do have to turn over a large amount of material. Typically, that means a couple of pay stubs, your most recent, a couple of bank statements, again, your most recent. Sometimes they'll ask for your tax return that shows your annual salary. You may also need to provide what's called an employment verification letter or an offer letter that shows your annual salary on it. If you are still a student, you will want to have your financial aid information on hand. So for example, if you're a graduate student and you're planning on using your graduate student loans to pay for an apartment, you'll want to be able to show, okay, this is the total amount in aid that I was offered. Here's my bill. Here's what's left over that I can use for housing. And then usually you'll need a copy of your photo ID. This is, again, the typical requirements. Some landlords may ask for more, some landlords may ask for less. If you don't meet those income requirements, which is often the case for current students, you will likely need to find a guarantor. A guarantor will need to have excellent credit, and a guarantor will usually have a higher income threshold, often 70 or 80 times the annual rent instead of the 40 times that's required for the tenant. And the guarantor will also need to submit these documents when you're applying for the apartment. So keep that in mind. And yeah, I see that question in the chat. We'll be sending out afterwards a sort of checklist that has this information on it as well. Again, this may vary on place to place, but this is the sort of most common set of requirements. And I would say have these together before you go visit apartments. Like send these to yourself in an email, have them ready to go, because if you see an apartment that you really like, it will go quickly, and being able to get your application in first is usually what determines whether or not you get the apartment, assuming that you qualify for it. So now that you've applied for the apartment, you've viewed an apartment, you've found it, you've applied, your application has been accepted, how much money do you actually need to have on hand? Almost all of the time, you will definitely need a first month's rent and a security deposit. And thanks to legislation passed, I believe in 2019 in New York State, at the very least, your security deposit will not exceed the first 1 month's rent. In some apartments, you may need to also pay a broker fee. Like I said, that's 15% the annual rent. And then on top of that, often they'll ask for a $20 application fee. This is going to be non-refundable. So if you apply to 5 different apartments, you're probably going to be spending $100 in application fees. So keep that in mind. And so to give you an example of what that could look like, say you find a 3-bedroom apartment. There are 3 of you who are going to live there. The total rent on that unit, on that apartment unit, is $3,000. Assuming you're splitting everything evenly, each roommate will owe $1,000 for your first month's rent, $1,000 for your security deposit, and then if there's a 15% broker, if there's that broker fee, which again is 15% of the annual rent, you will each owe an additional $1,800. So that's the $3,000 for the monthly rent times 12 months. 15% of that divided by 3 is that $1,800 per person. And so for this, sample apartment, the $3,000 apartment with a broker fee, each person will need to pay $3,800 to move in, which is a lot of money. So this is why it's really, really important to start budgeting. If you're planning on moving off campus, start budgeting early, because you will often need a pretty hefty chunk just to get into the apartment. It can be really, really frustrating. So that's one example. There are some other costs that you'll want to factor into your budget. These will depend on you and your circumstances and what you're bringing with you. So if you have a lot of furniture already, you will probably need to hire a U-Haul, or you'll probably need to hire moving services. That can cost from hundreds to thousands of dollars, depending on how much moving you're personally going to be doing. If you're taking out new utilities, and if you're moving into a brand new apartment, you will often have to pay an installation or an activation fee. So like you're getting Wi-Fi set up, usually you'll pay like X amount for the monthly service. I think I pay $50 a month for my Wi-Fi. And then you may have to pay an additional one-time installation and activation fee. So that's something to budget for. If you have only lived in residence halls and don't have any furniture at home, you will need some furniture. Ideally a bed with a bed frame. Your back will thank you. You may need a desk, you may need chairs, you may need a clothing rack. If your apartment doesn't have a closet, you may find a dresser to be beneficial. I lived out of a suitcase for a couple of months when I first moved to the city, and it was not pleasant. So there are all sorts of things that you may need to pick up for furniture. You may need to buy kitchenware, you may need to buy decor, you'll need cleaning supplies, you'll need hygiene supplies. Those are some important things to factor into your budget. You might not need to buy all of this at once. I have found that my partner and I tend to pick up, we'll replace one piece of furniture, like we'll upgrade something maybe every move. So you don't need to like furnish an entire apartment all at the same time, but this is money that you should be aware of that you may need to spend. There are ways to mitigate those costs. So Eugene put in the chat some links to some secondhand places. In New York City, we have a grand tradition of finding non-fabric pieces on the curb. If it has fabric, it may have bed bugs, so don't bring that into your house, but like nice wood chairs, those sorts of things. There's actually an Instagram account called Stooping NYC that spots really like beautiful pieces on the curb. I've got friends who have found absolutely astonishing like desks and dressers and things like that, just walking around the city. So there are ways to mitigate some of these costs, but keep in mind that they are expenses that you may have. Here is a kind of quick sample budget for a mystery person. So this person isn't paying a broker fee, but they might spend $2,000 just to sign the lease and just to get on the lease. They may need to spend an additional $900 on like a bed, some basic furniture, some basic cookware, those sorts of things. I came up with these figures by just going to like the IKEA website and looking up like how much does a desk cost, how much does a chair cost. So your expenses, your costs may vary. And then there are the sort of miscellaneous costs. So your activation fees, your moving supplies, they can get surprisingly expensive. If you have friends who are helping you move, you should probably buy them like pizza and get them like dinner as a thank you for helping you move, those sorts of things. So for this person, their example startup costs might be $3,000. For some people, it'll be more. For some people, it'll be less. This is meant to kind of help you think about where you should be allocating your funds as you're planning to move off campus. A common question that I'm asked is, how do I know if I can afford the rent? The threshold that experts have used to determine whether or not somebody is what's called rent burdened is whether or not they're spending more than 30% of their pre-tax income on their rent. So if you're spending more than 30% of your pre-tax income, you are considered to be rent burdened. It is a real problem in New York City, I'm not gonna lie. Ideally, you will want to keep your rent at no more than 25% of your pre-tax income. And so when I am determining whether or not I can afford the rent on a unit, I will take my annual salary, I will do a little math and see, okay, what is 20%, 25% of my pre-tax income? If the listed rent on that apartment is more than that figure, I tell myself I'm not going to live there. Whether or not you're going to be able to find a unit that is under this threshold may be challenging. I want to be kind of realistic about the city. But that's the sort of, if you're trying to plan in an ideal world, what's my budget? Shoot for 25% or less of your income. That way you have room for student loan repayments, groceries, savings, doing exciting things and not just sitting at home all the time, right? That sort of thing. So that's the kind of threshold you want to shoot for. So how much is the rent actually is another question I get often. These are some graphics that I put together using publicly available data from a service called Zoomper. They also, I believe, list apartments. So they're like, they provide the data, but they also like have listings. I collected this information in March of 2022. The rents may have changed since then. I know it's only been a couple of months, but things can fluctuate. I also used median rent to determine these, to make these graphics because because an average rent will be skewed at the top by luxury apartment buildings. So keep that in mind. What I really wanted to show, and I've got graphics for other boroughs in the city as well, what I really wanted to show is one, the impact of neighborhood on your overall rent. A 1-bedroom in Chelsea is much, much more expensive than a 1-bedroom in Chinatown, which is not that far away from Chelsea. So where you live will often determine how much you pay. The other thing I wanted to show is how much cheaper it is if you live with roommates. And so that second chart, those figures are, I took the median rent of 3-bedroom apartments, and then I divided them in 3, showing what each person who lived in that apartment would likely be paying. So as you can see, things get a lot more affordable as soon as you introduce even just a couple of roommates. And so this is Manhattan, the kind of the grayed out part in the center is just Central Park. These are just averages. Again, I'm not saying that if you live on the Upper West Side, you are guaranteed to be paying at least $3,500. I live on the Upper West Side. That is not what I pay in my monthly rent, not even close to it. So you will be able to find cheaper units in even the most expensive neighborhoods. But this is meant to kind of give you a sense for, you know, what to expect in different parts of the city. And so this is Manhattan. This next one is, skipped ahead. This next one is Brooklyn. As you can see, the parts of Brooklyn that are closer to downtown, that are closer to Manhattan, tend to be more expensive than farther out in the borough. The other thing I want to mention about living in the outer boroughs is train access. I actually had to go to Midwood yesterday to sign my lease, the leasing agency, that's where they were. And I got off at the very end of the 5 train, at the very last stop at Brooklyn College. And I had to go like another 1.5 miles down Flatbush Avenue to actually get to the leasing agency. But the train didn't go farther than that. And so the train access in the outer boroughs may not meet your needs if you are heavily reliant on public transportation. You may find it more beneficial, for example, if you live deep in Queens or deep in Brooklyn, to get a car, and that will add to your transit expenses. And so that's something to keep in mind. Even if you're paying less in rent, you may be paying more in public transit. And so here's Brooklyn. Here is Queens, again, closer to Manhattan. You're going to be paying a little bit more. Here is the Bronx, same thing. If you live with roommates, it's going to be cheaper. I didn't put together a graphic for Staten Island just because there just aren't as many NYU students who live there after graduation because of the ferry, but there are other places you can live, like Staten Island, New Jersey, very, very common for people to live in Jersey City. There are easy transit options from Jersey City and other places near there into parts of New York. A lot of people live in Westchester. A lot of people live on Long Island. This is meant to just sort of give you a quick overview of how much it's going to cost to live in different places. And so thinking a little bit more about, okay, I want to save some money. I'm going to have some roommates. Here are some questions that you should be asking each other when you are both planning on moving in and shortly after you have moved in. So number one, how am I going to split the rent? In all of my examples, I have shown splitting the rent evenly, but that might not make sense for your apartment. I have a good friend who he lived in a 3-bedroom for a number of years, and 2 of those bedrooms were giant and gorgeous, tons of natural light, really, really nice bedrooms, big size, great. The 3rd room, it was a closet. You could barely fit a double bed in there. It was really, really tiny. And the person who lived in that tiny room did not pay the same in rent as the people who lived in the much larger rooms. And so that may be a better distribution of the costs if you have an apartment with very different bedroom sizes. So that's a conversation you should have. Another conversation you should have is, how are we going to pay the rent? At my current place, our landlord requests that we mail them a check. And so every single month I write a check. I actually have to put mine in the mail today before I forget. So I write a check every month, but in order for there to be all of the money that needs to be in my bank account when that check is cashed, my partner has to send me her share of the rent a couple of days before the rent is actually due, so that the money is there when my landlord goes to cash that check. And so that's a conversation you should have. If one person is paying it, y'all should talk together about, okay, well, if I have to Venmo you, by what day do I need to Venmo you? Are we going to use Venmo? Are we going to use a bank transfer, et cetera, et cetera? That's a really important conversation. Other things to talk about are who's bringing what furniture, Will certain items be communal? Some people get really like, I had a roommate once who was like, this is my TV and you can only use it if you ask me because I paid for the TV, which cool, whatever. But like, that's a conversation you should have. You also want to talk about shared expenses like toilet paper, hand soap, kitchen towels, those sorts of things. You want to have a talk about, okay, is it just every time somebody buys this, we split it 3 ways? Is it I buy this, you buy that? That's something you want to discuss. And then finally, whose name is going on what utilities? And keep in mind that for utility payments, typically you'll get a better rate if you have a better credit score. So if there's somebody with really good credit in your housing group, maybe their name should go on the utilities because you'll get, again, a better deal. So those are things to keep in mind. Have these conversations during the process. Don't wait until you've been living in a place for a month to start having them. Moving on, I think the last couple of things you'll want to be aware of as you're coming up with your budget. Laundry. If you have in-unit washer dryer, it'll be free because it'll be in your unit, but you may have slightly higher utilities because of that. In building washer dryer, usually you're paying $1 or $2 to wash and $1 or $2 to dry each load. A laundromat will typically be around the same price, but you just have the extra kind of hassle of carrying your clothes outside of your apartment. If you're doing something like wash and fold, however, that may be $10 or $20 per load, and that's usually charged by weight. Same thing with dry cleaning, it'll vary by item. It tends to be more expensive. Some landlords require renter's insurance, so be sure to look into that. That's usually $5 to $15 a month, or you pay a little bit less if you buy it annually. You may want streaming services. That's going to cost money. So think about that. There are some, by the way, that you get for free as an NYU student. So keep that in mind. If you have a pet, that's going to cost, that's an expense you want to be aware of. And keep in mind that if you're traveling, you should be budgeting for a pet sitter if you can't bring your pet with you. You want to make sure that you can pay someone to look after your cat or your dog or whatever pet you have. And then again, the other sort of routine expenses would be cleaning supplies, hygiene supplies, deodorant, soap, that sort of thing. And lastly, a lot of apartments in New York City don't have built-in climate control. I would love to have it, but alas, so you may need to buy like a fan or a window AC unit. Maybe you need to pay someone to install that window AC unit. So those are other expenses to keep in mind. Here is a sort of sample budget. Again, this is a sample. Oops. Did I miss transit? Oh, shoot. I think I skipped through this page on transit. So let me quickly cover this too. You have public transit options. An unlimited Metro card currently is $127 a month. If you are not commuting every day, you probably don't need an unlimited Metro card. I work in person twice a week. I don't have an unlimited. It's just not worth it for me. So think about before you get one of those, think about how many trips you take to see if you'll actually save money. Currently, the new payment system, Omni, has a fare capping pilot. So after 12 trips a week, you don't pay anything. It works out to be spending about $33. So if you take like 15 trips a week, if you use Omni, you'll only pay for the first 12. So that's something to keep in mind. Other railroads like Metro North or Long Island Railroad, they offer discounts if you buy a monthly pass. NYU students can also benefit from a discount program we have with New Jersey Transit. So if you're still a student here and you're commuting from New Jersey, or you're planning on moving to someplace like Jersey City, there's a discount. Once you start working in the city, your employer may offer commuter benefits. That's how I actually pay for transit. I have a transit card, and I can either use it as a debit card at the taps for Omni, or I can use it at the machines to load up a Metro card. And it's pre-tax money, which saves you a little bit. Some employers also offer like discounts for things like City Bike or Bike Share. So maybe you live in Brooklyn and your office is just a bike ride away. That may be a great option for you. And then of course you could also take like a cab, a Lyft, or an Uber. That tends to be more expensive, but I always recommend students especially budget at least 1 or 2 cab rides into your transit budget, just in case. So that way it's there if you need it. If you don't, you can funnel that money to something else at the end of the month. And also, be sure to include money in that budget for a tip. So that's transit, didn't mean to skip over that. So now that I've gone over kind of the basics of everything that could go into your budget, here's an example of what that budget could look like. So this person, I've assumed that they're living in a 3-bedroom apartment. They have laundry in their building. Their heat and their water is included in their rent, and they're spending about a half hour on the train to get to campus. And so for this person, they'd maybe be spending $1,000 on rent, Their share of the internet might cost $17. Their share of the electric and gas might cost $40. So spending close to $60 on utilities. They're spending maybe $300 on groceries, which we'll talk more about in a second, maybe $100 on takeout, 10 to 20 on laundry, and another about 160 on transit. So this could be a monthly budget for a student or for somebody who's working, in their first job. And so this is one way that you can organize your budget when you're thinking about how much should I spend each month living off campus. So now we're going to talk, lastly, before we talk about food, just about thinking through how do I choose a neighborhood. Here are some instructions. Feel free to screenshot for about how long it takes to get to different trains. Excuse me, how long it takes to get to campus from different train lines. I have found that using the train lines is sort of how I pick where I want to live. So I usually take the RW to work. So I want to live off like the Q or something that's easy to get to the Q because I like that it's an express train. And then I usually only need to take 1 or 2 local stops. It makes my commute faster. If you're working at some place that's a transit hub, like if you're working in the financial district where every single train goes there, that may open up your housing options a little bit more. So that's something to think about. When you're choosing a neighborhood, you also want to think about what are the things I need in my building. So if I don't have laundry in my building, I don't want to pay that much in, if I want to find a cheaper building, save some money on rent, how close is the nearest laundromat or wash and fold? That's something to keep in mind. You want to think about what are my grocery and my food options. If you're somebody who plans to cook, you probably want to live close to a grocery store. Similarly, you want to also think about what are the sound and noise levels that I can tolerate. When I was younger, I was up till 2, 3 in the morning. I didn't care how loud it was fine. Now that I am less young, I like a quiet neighborhood. If I want to go out, I know that I can take the train to like the East Village. I don't know if I would necessarily want to live there because it tends to be a little bit loud at night. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're picking a neighborhood. So that's all of the kind of housing budgeting stuff. I'm going to spend now a few minutes talking about food options, thinking about grocery shopping, and hopefully giving you some pointers for how you can come up with a grocery budget. I'm going to show you a couple of charts. I know it's a kind of big amount of data all at once. A couple of disclaimers. NYU obviously doesn't endorse any individual grocery store, that sort of thing. These are all grocery stores that are within a short walk from the Washington Square campus. So if you live in Brooklyn, for example, even if there is a Gristedes or a Key Food near you, those prices may be different at your local grocery store. So keep that in mind. The list of items represent what my colleagues and I thought were general staples. I don't expect every single person to buy this list of items every single time they go to the grocery store. Like if you're using a liter of cooking oil a week, that's a lot of cooking oil, but more so a good mix of items most people will at some point, in a month or in 2 months will probably purchase. And what I really want to emphasize here is the value of shopping around, and also the real wild amount of variation certain items have across different stores. For example, it was very, very surprising to me to see that you could be paying like $1.50 more for Hot Pockets, depending on whether or not you went to Gristedes or Key Food. It's the same item with a huge, huge price difference. Same thing for ice cream. And we did our best. This isn't super scientific. We did our best to look for the same items at the same places. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this. But hopefully this gives you some insight into, again, just how much groceries cost, and also some of the benefits and trade-offs of going to one store to get everything versus picking up a few things from one store and picking up a few things from another store. These are all what I would consider full service grocery stores. This data is from what I would call convenience stores. So it's a little bit shorter list. I took off meat and things like that. So here we've got the Duane Reade on 4th and Broadway, the CVS in Astor Place, and then Sidestein on campus, as well as Space Market, which is also right on campus. And for certain things, we've also controlled we've done some math to make the portion size the same. So like for cooking oil at Side Scene, for example, they didn't have a 1 liter size. They had like, I think a 250 milliliter size. So we just took the price for that and multiplied it by 4. So that's why some of these like numbers may look a little odd. But hopefully this is helpful to understand, again, just how much you'll need to be spending on groceries, and gives you a sense of kind of the pros and cons of, yes, you save time by just going to one place, or yes, you may save time by going just to a convenience store, but it may cost some extra money. Thinking about how should you make your grocery budget, there are different places that will kind of tell you, you should be spending this much, you should be spending that much. I don't really want to say like only spend 150, only spend 250. I don't think that's super helpful for people. Instead, I'd invite you to kind of ask yourself these questions. First, what is your current spending? What are you spending on groceries? It does not feel good to track spending. I find that a lot of the time when we talk about budgeting, it's very easy to feel a lot of complicated emotions, maybe guilt, maybe shame. But I would encourage you to sort of push past those feelings and just sort of look at it as like, I need to know where my money is going right now so that I can make more intentional decisions about where I want it to go. And so I would highly, highly recommend take a month, track your spending and see how much am I actually spending on groceries, because that will give you some more insight for your unique circumstances and what you should be spending. Other things you want to think about are pantry items versus perishables. Pantry items are things that you're going to be buying maybe once or twice a year, or once, maybe just once a month, as opposed to things like fresh fruits, fresh veggies, that sort of thing. Think about how much time you have to shop. Like you hopefully saw from those charts, going to just one store may save you time, but it may also cost some money. Similarly, how much are you planning to cook during the week? Are you planning to eat out? Are you planning to pick up little snacks here and there? That will help determine your grocery budget. Similarly, how much time you have in a week to spend cooking and cleaning. Keep in mind also that if you have particular dietary needs, you may have to go to a specialized grocery store. That may take some extra travel time and expense. Another thing that I think is easy to overlook is how much storage space do you have? So like, I'm a big fan of the Trader Joe's, like frozen food, like the frozen orange chicken and that sort of thing. And at one of my first apartments, I had a couple of roommates and we had a tiny freezer. And most of my groceries were frozen. There were things I could just quickly, throw in the pan, they'd be ready in a couple of minutes. And I very quickly was like, oh no, there is not room for all of us to keep all of our stuff in the freezer. And so we had to kind of negotiate as a household, but I also had to kind of change my spending and change my grocery list because of that. And then finally, you may need to spend a little bit of money up front to build a pantry. So spices, purchasing seasoning, all of those things that you like to have around, your soy sauces, those sort of things. Those tend to be, you buy it once, you don't need to buy them again for a while. Be aware that if you don't have them yet, it will cost some money to build up that collection. So hopefully these are helpful guidelines and ways to sort of start thinking about, how do I go about making a grocery budget? Here's an example. Again, I came up with this using the chart and just by looking at my own grocery spending. So this person could be spending about $220 a month. Looks like about a $50 a week expenditure, plus the sort of like staple costs of like maybe needing to refill a spice or two, maybe needing to buy bread, buy rice, buy sauce, that kind of thing. And so that's one example budget. And this is being recorded, and we'll send this out for those of you who are asking. So yeah, we will send out the recording. We'll send it to you, or it'll be on our website that you can access it later. So that's, before I wrap up talking about grocery lists, this is a list of tips from NYU students and from other folks in college. So among these tips are pay attention to the unit price, right? Some things may be cheaper if you buy in bulk. Keep in mind that if you're trying to price compare, you could use something like Instacart just to see what the prices are before you actually go out and head to the store. Typically, it will be cheaper to shop around. I usually actually go to Trader Joe's for like the bulk of my groceries. Then I'll go to like a Fairway or someplace like that to get like snacks and things like that, because they have what I want. So shopping around will take more time, but it may be cheaper. In New York City, you have to be able to pay a bag fee, so you can save some money by carrying 1 or 2 reusable bags. Grocery shopping during the week tends to be better than going on the weekend, because on the weekends they're more crowded. No brand or store brand items tend to be cheaper than name brand items. And then finally, don't forget to check out specialty stores. So a place like H Mart or Citarella will have, these are chains, will have items that may be hard to find elsewhere. And then your neighborhood will likely have a lot of more locally owned grocers that have a very particular culinary focus. So like Murray Hill, for example, has a lot of really great Indian grocery stores. Chinatown obviously has a lot of like great East Asian, flavors and groceries and spices and things like that. So keep that in mind as well. And so heading into the home stretch here, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about how off-campus housing may interact with your financial aid. So when thinking about the larger context of living off campus, this little chart is the 2022-2023 cost of attendance. This is something that NYU uses to calculate the total aid that we can give out to students. And so NYU in general expects that it'll cost about $20,000 for food and housing. That's what room and board is. It'll cost about $750 for books and supplies, about $1,200 for transportation to and from campus from your home residence, as well as another close to $3,000 on personal expenses, which includes clothing, expeditions, places, transportation within New York City, et cetera, et cetera. This is an overview of the cost of attendance. This is an estimate. This is not inherently what you must spend, but it is a reasonable expectation that a student attending NYU may need to spend these figures. So that's the kind of larger context that you can put your food and your housing budget into. And I hope that this is helpful. And this also does not include tuition, as you can see. So zooming back in and thinking specifically like, hey, I have financial aid at NYU. I want to live off campus. Will my aid change? It will not. Because NYU uses the cost of attendance to award aid, it doesn't mean we're necessarily looking at individual students' bills, right? Even a student who doesn't live on campus will need funds to have housing. And so if your financial aid, say your NYU scholarship covers your tuition and room and board in your freshman year, and you want to move off campus as a sophomore, the amount of money from your scholarship that would normally cover your NYU housing and your NYU meal plan would be refunded to you, usually through direct deposit, that you can then use to pay for an apartment. And so if your bill is like, I don't know, $60,000 and that's tuition and fees, but your aid is $80,000, that extra $20,000 would be refunded to you. So you won't lose your financial aid, if assuming it's your NYU scholarship, if you decide to move off campus. So I want to clarify that. And that's something, if you're really worried about it, meet one-on-one with me or one of my colleagues and we kind of go through the particulars of it, just so you can feel a little bit more secure. The last topic before I get to resources is short-term housing. And so typically, if you live in an apartment, you have a lease, and that's for a year. If you don't want to sign a full year-long lease or a full year-long commitment, you can do something called subletting. And so when you are living in a sublet, it means that the tenant of the apartment, the person who's on the lease, is essentially letting you live in their room for a period of time, and you would pay rent to that tenant. Subletting is great for short-term stays or for when you want a little bit of flexibility. You can sublet for years at a time. More commonly, it's just a few months. And the one thing you want to keep in mind, if, for example, say you sign a lease and your lease is June to June, but I want to be abroad this summer. I'm going to study abroad and I'm not going to be living in my apartment over the summer. Look at your lease, see whether or not subletting is allowed. If it is, then you'll be able to find somebody to live in your room and they will pay you rent so that you don't have to pay effectively double rent. So that's what subletting is there for. Again, it varies considerably. I'd recommend getting, if you are going to sublet, getting some sort of like agreement written up just so everybody's kind of on board about who is paying rent to, who's paying how much rent to whom and at what times. But yeah, that's what subletting is in a nutshell. Thinking about study away, Eugene already put this in the chat, but Global Programs has a list of cost estimates on housing, dining, airfare, transit, et cetera, for each of our global sites. So if you're trying to figure out, hey, I want to study away, this is how I can afford it. If you, again, like I said, already live in New York City and have an apartment, you may want to sublet your apartment while you're studying away. And keep in mind that if you need to store your belongings because you're subletting or maybe you're temporarily moving out, you have a lot of different options. There are a bunch of different like storage services. A lot of them have student discounts. That's what I did in college. I lived in the residence halls, but I didn't want to like move all of my books back home. And so I would get like a summer storage unit with, I think I used like Manhattan Mini Storage. There are a bunch of different ones. But I did that just to avoid having to pay moving fees. And if you just have a few things that you need to store, that's what friends are for. I've done that before too, just like dropped off a backpack full of things at a friend's apartment and picked it up when I came back. So that's the kind of gist of the kind of main things we've gone over. I want to close out with just a few resources and leave some time, a few minutes for questions at the end. Again, we'll be sending out a follow-up with some of this information as well. In terms of resources here at NYU, you are more than welcome to meet with me or one of my colleagues. This QR code will take you to our scheduling page. We are more than happy to have an individual conversation with you about your budget, how to build credits, how to set and make financial goals, all of those sorts of things. You can chat with us about them. So you can scan that code or go into NYU Connect and go to the financial education service card. Another great resource is iGrad. And Eugene will also put links to these in the chat, but iGrad is fantastic. There are a bunch of different articles and tools on there. It's a really great one-stop shop to sort of learn kind of basic terms, things like that. There's the Off-Campus Living website, which I went over at the beginning. That has a really, really comprehensive overview of all of the ins and outs of specific like terminology unique, especially to New York City. And then finally, there's the NYU page on food accessibility assistance in case you need assistance. You have experiencing food insecurity and that sort of thing. There are a couple of different resources available to you in that situation. So those are the NYU resources. And then some other resources I wanted to spotlight are the Met Council on Housing. They are a local tenants' rights organization. They have a really, really detailed online database for if you're ever like having some sort of conflict with your landlord or you're not quite sure what your rights are, check them out. They also have a free telephone hotline. So again, they're not lawyers, but they are able to answer sort of the most common questions about what are your rights as a renter. I also wanted to include a link to the New York City Mayor's Office tenants website. Here's an overview of your rights as a tenant and tenant protection legislation in New York City. There's also an easy way to see if your apartment has rent stabilization. And then finally, I wanted to link a page to SNAP benefits, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's a federally funded nutrition assistance program. The benefits are currently under COVID extended to students. So if you are experiencing food insecurity, that's a great place to turn. They will make it a little bit easier to get affordable groceries. So I know I have been talking a lot. We have about 5 or so minutes for questions. So I'm going to stop my screen share and feel free to, oops, let me escape that so that I can actually see the screen. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat or come off of mute. And like I said, oh, go ahead.
So where can we find a recording of this?
We will make it available either on our website or on our YouTube page. And we'll send out an email to everybody who participated with the follow-up resources.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, the recording will have, you'll be able to see the slides. We're in the process of updating our website. So we'll have some online resources. I'm not sure if the entire PowerPoint will end up there, but the recording will be there as well as links. And I'm actually going to stop the recording now.